Good morning. Time now 9:38 a.m. on Friday, July 14th, 2023. We are extraordinarily sorry that we keep you wait. We are still waiting commentator Professor Ueda coming in. He's been trying to connect in the last 6 minutes, but hopefully we'll be able to have him on board soon. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo online seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online seminars to introduce the latest World Bank report featuring the authors who actually are the economists and specialists of the World Bank. This morning, we have a special session featuring the latest report, Falling Long-Term Growth Prospect, subtitled Trends, Expectations, and Policies. This report was issued in late March this year, so pretty much new report. We are extraordinarily pleased to have two co-authors of the report. Let me introduce each one of them briefly. First, we have Aihan Kosei, who is a Deputy Chief Economist and the Director of the Prospect Group, who actually appeared in our morning seminar earlier, several weeks ago, to introduce the JEP Global Economic Prospect. But during the discussion, actually, we touched upon this report. So we asked him to give another round of the presentation on this new book. Aihan, good morning to you. Good evening to you. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you, Koichi, for the invitation.
Great, thank you very much. And also we have Franziska Onezoge, who was the manager of the Prospect Group when we announced the seminar, but she became the chief economist for South Asia region as of July this month. So this is her second or third week as the chief economist of the South Asia. Congratulations to you, and then thank you for joining us, Franziska. Can you hear me?
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Great, thank you very much. We have simultaneous interpretation this morning. If you want to take advantage of simultaneous interpretation, on your screen, bottom left side, there is a Earth look like logo, and then please push this button and to make a selection of the language between English and Japanese. And let me switch into Japanese to make the same announcement. おはようございます。今日のセミナーは、日本語と英語の同時通訳の提供をしております。で、日本語でセミナーをお聞きになりたい方は、皆さんご覧いただいている WebEx のスクリーンの下の左側にこの地球儀のようなロゴがあります。で、ここをクリックしていただくと、日本語あるいは英語を選択することができるようになっておりますので、どうぞご活用ください。それからこの後、基調報告、そしてコメント、その後にですね、質疑応答の時間を設けます。で、皆様からの質問をお待ちしておりますが、皆様からの質問は日本語で書いていただいて結構です。で、画面の下右側に Q&A、クエスチョンマークのクリックがあります。ここをクリックしていただいて、で、スピーカー全員に対して日本語で結構ですので、質問を書いていただければ、質疑応答の時に私読み上げまして、で、これは日本語で読み上げますが、同時通訳がついておりますので、問題なくスピーカーには伝わりますので、ぜひ皆様からの質問をお待ちしたいというふうに思います。で、また英語に戻ります。Also, during the Q&A session, we would definitely like to have your questions. So please post your question on the Q&A section on the WebEx screen. On the bottom right side, there is a question mark or Q&A sign. Click it and then post your questions there. Then I will read your question on your behalf during the Q&A session, asking the speakers to respond. So with that, I would like to ask Aihan and Franziska formally coming in. And then before that, I just wanted to make sure that we are going to have Professor Kenichi Ueda of University of Tokyo as a commentator. I think he's still struggling technically to coming in, but I'll make a formal introduction when he comes in. With that, Aihan and Franziska, please come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi, and greetings to all from Washington, D.C. It's great to be with you. I think it could have been even better if we were in Tokyo doing this presentation. And I'm very happy Francisca is joining us. We are, of course, both very, very pleased, Koichi putting together these programs and the Tokyo office promoting the work of the World Bank very nicely with these programs. Hopefully Kenichi is going to join us, our ex-colleague from the International Monetary Fund. It's wonderful to have Kenichi as a discussant. So we have some slides we are going to show you. Let me share them with you, and then we can. Yeah, so as Koichi already mentioned, we released this study earlier in the year. The World Bank has certain objectives. Of course, one of them is poverty reduction and improving prosperity in a livable planet. That's only possible. We have growth, and that growth should be sustainable, equitable, and of course, sustained as well. In this new study, we look at this issue, try to understand the long-term growth prospects around the world in advanced economies as well as emerging market developing economies. The issue about long-term growth has been, as many of you know, extensively discussed. Whether we will have higher growth in the coming years or lower growth, it's been a discussion among respected academics, policymakers. We just picked up two quotes from two very famous academics. Obviously, in recent years, there has been this hope that these new machine learning systems, AI algorithms, will change basically how we approach work. And here, Eric Bjørnholm claims that these types of systems will lead to not just higher productivity growth, but lead to more widely shared prosperity. So the idea is that we are going to become much more productive because of these algorithms. With the help of machines, they are going to learn, inherently. On the other hand, there are very respected academics like Robert Gordon claiming that yes, these new technologies can make a difference, but the difference is going to be in marginal areas of the economy. They are not going to make a big difference when it comes to productivity growth in the aggregate in our big economy. So as economists, we are not necessarily very well equipped to think about the implications of these types of new technologies. But what we can do, based on the data we have and the techniques we have to talk about long-term growth prospects using traditional methods of economics. So what does that mean? It means basically looking at potential growth, not just basically for certain economies, but for a large number of economies, as I'm going to talk about. We can look at it at a global level, advanced economies, emerging developing economies. We can also look at, of course, the regional dimensions of growth. Then there are certain ingredients of growth, like investment. And We can look at the kind of the how investment is changing, how regional dimensions of investment have been evolving. And we can, against the background of what we learn, look to the future and what types of rewards are there, what types of risks are there, and policies are there. In the book, we have all of these issues in different chapters discussed. In addition, we have a chapter about international trade. As many of you know, trade has been an engine of growth for a long period of time, but in recent years, we have seen a significant slowdown relative to what we saw in previous decades. So whether trade can continue to be an engine of growth. And then in many circles, services growth, the services sector becoming much more powerful in terms of generating jobs, seen as a growth engine. But is that viable? What is the potential of that sector? So in the book, we have 7 chapters looking at different aspects of these questions. Our framework centers around this idea of we need to have a much better understanding of potential growth. And the potential growth is basically, you can think of as an economy speed limit, the maximum growth rate that an economy can deliver in the long term when it fully utilizes these resources like employment, the labor source, and then, of course, the capital stock without igniting inflation. So you are driving a car, you can get it to the speed limit, but if you basically go beyond the speed limit, the engine starts basically boiling and you can have problems. It's the same with, and of course, the economy. If you push the economy too hard, that can lead to inflation beyond its capacity. Potential growth is very important when it comes to policy formulation. When you think about monetary policy or when you think about fiscal policy, you need to have a good sense of potential growth. Central banks spend a huge amount of resources to measure a country's potential growth. Of course, when you set up plans for the future, you need to have a good sense of the country's potential. It's a very useful concept, but it's not an observable concept, so we need to estimate it. It's not like there are some time series out there we monitor and then we say, oh, okay, here is the potential growth. It's not like GDP growth. In this book, the bank basically releases its first comprehensive database of the 9 most commonly used measures of potential growth for 170 countries over the period 1981 to 2021. We, as I mentioned, also looked at the global, regional, and country-specific dimensions of potential growth in detail in the study. This is a rather sizable study. The good news is that it's possible to increase the rate of potential growth. So countries don't have to basically become the prisoner of the decline in potential growth. They can have policy interventions to improve productivity, investment, and labor supply. Now, there are different measures of potential growth. In our database, we have 9 measures. Here, when we talk about the growth prospects, we are going to focus on production function approach, and that's very useful because it tells us what are the drivers of potential growth, and then it basically is useful when we conduct projections exercises, when we look at the future of potential growth. There are some other measures based on time series techniques or simply based on the long-term growth forecasts. And all of these are available in the database. So against the background of this brief introduction, we are going to focus on 3 questions. The first one, how has potential growth evolved over time? And there, the basic message is going to be there has been a decline in potential growth, and that decline has been broad-based, and it has been broad-based when we think about the drivers of economic growth And of course, that the slowdown has been taking place while the global economy has been grappling with a series of adverse shocks. The second question is about the future. What are prospects for potential growth? And there, the news not necessarily good, because potential growth is expected to slow further in coming years in this decade, and there are downside risks around our baseline estimates. And what are the good news? The good news is that there are policies which we look at in this third question, countries can employ. So we have a number of exercises, but we look at whether countries undertake their best 10-year reform efforts. Can they stop the slowdown and reverse it when it comes to potential growth? And the good news is that they can do this. So throughout this presentation, we are going to use this acronym, emerging market and developing economies. I'm going to focus on the first question, and Francisca basically look at the second and third questions. Let me start with the first question here. Here you see on the left how potential growth has evolved over time. I think the first observation, how potential growth in the global economy declined from the first decade of this millennium to the second decade. So the global potential growth here estimated using the production function approach declined to 2.6% a year over the period 2011-21. It was around 3.5% in the first decade of the 2000s. So this decline was there, whether you look at advanced economies or emerging market developing economies. In fact, in emerging market developing economies, potential growth declined by 1 percentage point to 5% in the past decade. It was 6% in the first decade of the millennium. Now, some of you might say, why do I care about, the growth? I care about per capita potential growth. And there you can look at the middle panel, and you see that the decline in potential growth also manifested in the case of per capita potential growth. Per capita global potential growth declined to 2% over the past decade. In the first decade of the millennium, that number was around 2.7%. So this was a significant decline. In emerging market developing economies, per capita potential growth fell from 5% in 2000-2010 period on average to 4.2%. Then, of course, the next question, is this because we are using a certain measure of potential growth, we see this decline, or other measures basically telling, something different or something similar? As you see on the right, whatever measure of potential growth you use, you end up with the same outcome. Potential growth did decline from 2010 period to 2011 to 2021 period. Now, the other important observation when we looked what happened in the past, how broad-based the slowdown in potential growth is. In the left chart, you see that during 2011-21, potential growth was below the 2010 average in almost all advanced economies and close to 60% of emerging market developing economies. Economies with weaker potential growth from one decade to the next accounted for about 80% of global GDP. So in big chunk of global economy, basically, we were experiencing a slowdown in potential growth. In the center chart and the right chart, what you see how potential growth evolved in different regions the World Bank operates. Here you have East Asia Pacific, EAP, ECA, Europe, Central Asia, LAC, Latin America, Caribbean, MNA, Middle East, North Africa, SAR, South Asia region, and then SSA is Sub-Saharan Africa. Basically everywhere you see a little bit of a slowdown, except SAR and Sub-Saharan Africa, the slowdown is a bit more moderate. The steepest slowdown between the first and second decade of the 2000s took place in Middle East, North Africa, and followed by East Asia and Pacific. Although in the case of East Asia and Pacific, potential growth remained one of the two highest among EMD regions. The other one, of course, the South Asia region, thanks to India's phenomenal performance. When you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you see that potential growth hovering around less than 4%. That number is really not sufficient for Sub-Saharan Africa. You expect that region to do much better when it comes to potential growth. So what were the drivers of the slowdown? When we think about basically underlying drivers of potential growth, there we looked at, of course, productivity, in this case, total factor productivity, capital accumulation, basically investment, and then the labor supply. And you look at the drivers of potential growth, these three classical drivers, the productivity, capital formation, and the labor supply, contributed almost equally to the slowdown in potential growth. For example, slowing productivity growth accounted for about 0.4 percentage point of this decline. That's around 0.9 percentage point at the global level. Capital accounted for about 0.3 percentage point, and the labor accounted for another 0.3 percentage point. In emerging market developing economies, the slowdown was mostly driven by TFP growth. In fact, in that group, TFP growth accounted for 0.6 percentage point of this 1 percentage point decline I mentioned earlier. Now, when you look at the right chart, you see one thing that is quite striking. The contribution to EMD's investment growth by different country groups. The first observation is that from 2010 to 2021, the investment growth declined significantly. And of course, big countries have been contributing a lot. Their contribution got smaller, especially, of course, when you think about China's contribution. Then investment slowdown that reduced to contribution of capital accumulation to potential growth, but also slowed productivity growth because of much productivity enhancing technology is embedded in new investment. In the center chart, you see that it makes a difference when you have China in the sample or not in the sample. When you exclude China, there is still a slowdown in potential growth, but that slowdown is smaller. And of course, the potential growth in EMD is still weakening, but China's slowdown over the past decade also manifested itself in its potential growth, so it has significant implications. So let me turn to Francisca to look to the future and tell us, what are prospects and what types of policies should be undertaken to address this slowdown in potential growth.
Thank you, Ayhan. Yeah, so what does the future hold? It's not, okay, I think you can see it now. So I told you about the past developments over the past decade. What does the future hold? Pretty much more of the same, if not a bit more challenging. And that's what this chart here shows you. Remember, I had showed you there are 9 measures of potential growth in our database, but only one can be taken forward to a decade. The filters can go a year or two, but to the rest of the decade, there's only the production function approach that can be taken forward, because it's based on a regression analysis where you can use the predicted values, making certain of the relationships between investment and potential growth to project forwards under certain assumptions. So what the chart on the left here shows you, what potential growth will be for the 2020s under certain assumptions. And the specific assumptions we use are, so they kind of capture current trends, more current trends. That's the baseline scenario in this chart on the left. So the assumption is investment proceeds as consensus currently predicts 10 years ahead. Population demographics proceed as the United Nations population statistics assume. And improvements in health and education that kind of go into labor force participation and into productivity growth, those proceed at the same pace as they have been for as long as the data allows for each country. So it's very much at current trend scenario. And at current trends, you can see here the blue bars on the left, global potential growth will fall by another 1/4 percentage point. So it's already fallen by 0.9 percentage point from 3.5 to 2.6% over the last 2 decades. It'll fall by another 1/4 percentage point. And for emerging markets and developing economies, it's very easy. It used to be 6% in the first decade of the 2000s, 5% in the last decade, and it's going to be 4% over the remainder of this decade at current trends. Now, of course, the first question that we then receive is, yeah, that's just demographics. And that's why we have these orange and yellow bars here to show you it's not just demographics. What we do in these orange and yellow bars, we decompose that decline in our at current trends projection into that caused by demographics, so aging of the population. And that has 2 components, both fewer people, fewer working age people, and older people being less attached to the labor force. So the red bars are aging populations and the orange bars are everything else. A lot of that is investment. And you can see that actually globally, the population demographics is aging is only about half of the headwinds that potential growth is facing for the next decade. In emerging markets, about a quarter. They just have, they have a younger population and more of it is still growing into working age population. So that's kind of an at current trend scenario. What it also assumes is that there are no shocks, no major shocks. And that's one of the things we show in a dedicated chapter, in one of the chapters here in this book, is that when you have these big economic or physical disruptions, every one of them leaves a shadow. Every one of them casts a shadow. Everyone leaves lasting damage. So in the charts on the left here, you see an illustration of this lasting damage. So for example, after a recession, you see that 5 years later, potential output growth is still significantly less than if the recession had not occurred. The same thing after banking crisis. The same thing after epidemics, and there have been more than COVID. There's also been Zika and SARS, there have been other epidemics too. Yeah, so the point is that this at current trends baseline forecast is really assuming that there is no massive shock. And a massive shock would make it even worse. And this at current trends baseline scenario, that is something that is not just unique to a few big countries. I mean, in China, it's almost deliberate not to come to a more sustainable growth model. It's very much policy driven, for example, but it's something that cuts across regions. It's not just in a few countries, few large countries. And that's what this chart here illustrates to you. It shows that in just about every region, with very few exceptions, potential growth will slow, even in South Asia, although it's still very high, even in sub-Saharan Africa. It'll slow most in the 2 regions that are aging the fastest. In East Asia and the Pacific, EAP, and in Europe and Central Asia, what we call ECA. It'll slow least in sub-Saharan Africa because there's a sense that the population growth is they still have their demographic premium, but also these repeated shocks, terms of trade shocks, and debt crisis, that these will not repeat. So productivity will kind of recover from these repeated shocks after a few years. So that's the reason we have here higher, almost stable potential growth in sub-Saharan Africa. In South Asia, the story is slightly different. They have a lot of investment growth. They're the region with the strongest prospects for investment growth. And that does, in this framework, boost potential growth prospects. But the point here is really, it's a very broad-based phenomenon. It's not just one or two regions that are going to lose out. It's broad-based. So as Ayhan said, this looks fairly bleak. This is a fairly bleak outlook, but not all is lost. What we need to turn this outlook around is one of two things, or perhaps both. Either we need a policy miracle or we need a productivity miracle. So what we can quantify is the policy miracle. The productivity miracle, as Ayhan said already in this first slide with the quotes of Gordon and Brynjolfsson, that's much harder to quantify. But we can quantify, put some numbers on the policy miracle. So what are the policies that are needed? You will have seen a lot of them. What is needed is policies to boost growth. That's the first bucket here, structural policies. Policies to avoid crisis, because every one of these crises casts this long shadow, as you saw in the chart before. So simply avoiding crisis is a strategy that boosts long-term growth. So all the policies that come with macroeconomic stabilization. And of course, this is much more easily done in a globally cooperative environment. So in particular, in one that has open trade and very rules-based trade and investment environment, climate. So how much could be gained from a certain set of policies? And there we do a little thought experiment. And we deliberately pick a thought experiment that is not impossible, because it's been done before. That's just really difficult. It's not impossible, but unlikely. That's what you see here in the chart on the left. So the blue bars show you again our 2.4% and 2.2% here, a quarter percentage point decline in global potential growth. Same thing you saw before. But now we assume, what if every country repeated its own best effort, its own highest investment growth rate over any 10-year period, its own best improvement in female and older worker labor force participation over any 10-year period, and its own best increase in education and health outcomes over any 10-year period. And then you get the colorful bars here on the left. So you can see that a good chunk of an investment surge alone could offset about half, a third to a half, of this projected decline at current trends, potential growth. Much can be gained from labor force for increased labor force participation among especially female workers and especially older workers in advanced economies. So there are policies. These policies would be enough to not only stem the decline in potential growth, they would actually reverse it. Potential growth would not go all the way back to what it was in the early 2000s, but it would go a little bit back towards the early 2000s. Now, so to add a bit more color to this red bar here and to the purple bar, we have the chart here in the center and on the right. So one potential avenue that you could generate this purple bar could be green investment. There's a big green investment push that lays a foundation for future growth. And in principle, the needs for investment, for green investment, are very large. We have that in the chart here in the center. For 19 countries, a synthesis report of the country climate and development reports that the World Bank is gradually putting together for all its client countries. For 19 of them, a synthesis report gives us the average investment need for these countries. You can see it here. The average investment need for low-income countries is very high. These are the 30-ish poorest countries in the world. They need to have 8% of GDP additional investment to achieve a low-carbon path for growth, path for development. That's out of the range. That is a large amount. Take the lower middle income countries, a little less unrealistic, but also a large amount of investment needs, so on the order of 5%. More realistic is for upper middle incomes countries. That's where we have investment needs of somewhere between 1% and 2%. So that would go a ways. It would not be enough to fill that whole purple bar on the left, but it could go a ways towards filling that purple bar on the left. And as it happens, this is very much in line with the literature. We also did an extensive literature review in the context of green investment. Every piece we could find that was written by policy organizations or by academics on investment needs for climate-related purposes. And as it happens, the average across all these studies is investment needs across all countries. So it's really very much a rule of thumb. The average is about 2.5% of GDP, additional investment needed every year. So if that was actually made available, yeah, that could be a good part of that purple bar, that investment boost we need to sort of rekindle potential growth. In some regions, in addition, there is a lot of potential for increased labor force participation, and especially increased labor force participation among women. That's what the chart on the right shows you. It shows you the potential. This is the average labor force participation rate in the average emerging market and developing economy, on average in the Middle East and North Africa, the EMDs, and in South Asia. You can see that in these regions, female labor force participation is somewhere between half to 2/3 of the EMD average. If these two regions found the means to raise female labor force participation simply to the emerging market and developing economy average, that could boost their potential growth by a percentage point or more. So there are big potential gains to be reaped if the policies could be put together to achieve them. So this is our little thought experiment in the framework, in a very traditional framework. But then we looked in detail at two specific engines of growth, an old one and a new one. So the old engine of growth is trade. The new engine of growth is services. At least it's hoped to be a new engine of growth. And yes, everyone knows that the trade environment has become a bit more challenging. And, if anything, the slowdown in potential growth will also translate into slower trade growth. We see no reason why the elasticity of trade should suddenly increase again after it has just fallen. It's about halved from 1990 to a global financial crisis, and then over the last decade. It used to be a ratio of 2 to 1 between trade growth and output growth. In the last decade, it has been about 1 to 1. So for every percentage point output growth, global output growth, you would get 1 percentage point trade growth. There's really no reason to believe that that will change materially unless there's a big structural change over the next decade, which means that slowdown in potential growth going forward that we saw in the previous slide, that's going to translate into trade growth too. So making trade an engine of growth going forward is going to become more difficult than it used to be. But that does not mean that countries can't do it. They can do it, but they will have to do it in a more difficult way. They will have to do it by gaining market share. The pie is no longer growing that much, so they have to gain market share. And one way to gain market share in global markets is to reduce trade costs. And just to give you a little bit of background, trade costs double the cost of a domestically traded good. So on average, an internationally traded good is twice the price, the cost of a domestically traded good. And that's got very little to do with tariffs. So if trade costs are about 100% of the value of the good, tariffs are on average 5% of the value of the good. It's really not about tariffs. It's about the things that are shown here in the chart on the left. It's about logistics. It's about border documentation, border procedures. It's delays, just border procedures all around. It's about shipping, the quality of shipping, the ease of shipping. So we estimate here how much would trade cost, what is the relationship between bilateral trade cost and these specific indicators, as well as controlling for tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And then we do a little thought experiment again. What would happen if a country improved its logistics, its border procedures, and its shipping procedures, its shipping improvement, its shipping conditions. Which country? We assume that a country in the worst quartile of countries by these three measures improves these three conditions to the extent that it becomes like the country in the best quartile. So that's a very bold thought experiment. That's like saying we're turning Sierra Leone in the bottom quartile into a Poland in the top quartile, or Thailand in the top quartile. So it's a bold thought experiment. But this kind of thought experiment suggests that this big, bold reform effort could achieve a halving in trade costs. You can see that here in the comprehensive reforms. That's about half of the one-to-one, which is the no change scenario in the chart on the left. So there are things that countries can do, but they're very difficult to do. They come to down to these things like logistics, shipping, border documentations. That's on the old engine of growth. Now there are big hopes for a new engine of growth in advanced economies as well as in emerging markets and developing economies. So we have to see how that plays out. But just to remind you, this services growth has already been an engine of growth, especially an engine of employment growth. And you see that here in the chart in the center. For advanced economies, since 1995, it's actually been the sole driver of employment growth, services. And even in emerging markets and developing economies, and that's something people are less familiar with, even there, it's services growth that's driving or that has driven 2/3 of employment growth over the last, since 95, so over the last 2.5 decades. So services growth already plays a big role. The hope is now that this digitization that we saw during the pandemic will give another boost to services, and not just to digital services and information, IT, but that will then trigger other services improvements. And just to illustrate a bit what the boost that the pandemic has given to services, we have the chart here on the right where we've done surveys among firms in emerging markets and developing economies, where they asked these individual firms, how did you adjust to the pandemic, to COVID-19? And you can see that between the middle of 2020, so at the depth of the COVID-19 pandemic, and by late 2021, so deep into the recovery already, 2021 was the year of the recovery, you can see how many firms, a large number of firms, has dramatically increased its use of digital technologies. And not just in information and communications technologies, not just in ICT, across the board. You see this digitization across the industries, even in something as simple as transport of food services. Yeah, this is the Ubers. This is the Uber Eats kind of thing. But it's also back office work on transports and food services. So there's a lot of promise in this digitization. We'll have to see whether that actually translates then into larger potential growth. So this is kind of the policy miracle. What can be done? If nothing happens, we're probably back at current trends scenario where potential growth just will slow and we'll get used to it, unless we're lucky. Perhaps we'll just be very lucky and we will see that ChatGPT and artificial intelligence will bring the structural break that we really need to turn the current trends around. Maybe we will get that even without any policy effort. That remains to be seen, though. So let me summarize. First, how has potential growth evolved? That is unambiguous. Potential growth between the first and the second decade of the 2000s has slowed. Whichever way you slice it and dice it. It's slowed across, broad-based across countries, broad-based across measures, broad-based across drivers of growth. It's slowed. Looking forward, unless there's a big structural break and some change in policies or in productivity, potential growth is going to slow further and policymakers will have to get used to it. That means poorer fiscal sustainability. It means it'll be harder to achieve inflation targets, and it'll be harder, of course, to meet any of the development goals. So what is needed is really a structural break. It's a big policy push, not an impossible one, just an improbable one, difficult one. A big policy push by many countries at the same time to reverse this slowdown in global potential growth. Or it needs a miracle, a productivity miracle. So a lot of this work is detailed in our existing studies. What we've shown you in this particular presentation is here in this falling long-term growth study in the bottom row. But there's additional detail in these other ones. And with that, look very much forward to hearing from Kenichi and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayhan and Franziska, giving us the snapshot and actually detailed explanation with very punchy messages about the latest report that was put together by your team in the late March, falling long-term growth prospect. So we would like to ask Professor Kenichi Ueda of University of Tokyo to come in to share his comment. I hope he is corrected. He can hear us. We can hear him. Okay, Ueda Sensei, can you hear us?
Hi, hello. Hi,
Great,
how are
please.
you?
Thank you.
Good to see you. Sorry, a bit blurred background. Thank you, Ayhan and Franziska. Very interesting work. It's always interesting, but anyway, this time it's quite interesting about potential growth. Have a few comments. Nothing so much, I guess, critical about your studies. It's just wondering, what do you think? First of all, is theory and empirics of economic growth issues. Obviously, you mentioned one of the way to measure potential growth. One is production function approach, other one is the time series approach, and I don't know, the expectation. I think you took more time series, data-driven approach. But then on the other hand, there's a production function approach, or I would say the theoretical thinking. Theoretical thinking, as you know, in growth model, we have essentially two types of growth model, like neoclassical growth. Someone is frontier, the all other countries are trying to catching up. So one, and the other one is endogenous growth theory. It could have a parallel growth without catching up. Anyway, however, in reality, academic literature, as you know, I know, it's a mixture of both, right? Essentially, there's a catching up component, and also there can be a parallel component too. Anyway, so if we talk about the slowdown of worldwide potential growth rate, it could be two issues. One is a slowdown of frontier kind of frontier growth rate. That is more like advanced countries TFP growth. That's really a key issue, I believe. On the other hand, most of the developing country, I'm not so sure slowdown of potential growth is good or bad, because we do know China, India, for example, have grown a lot. So the first part of rapid growth of very, very poor to middle income, this we should see a rapid catching up process, which may be more or less ended for China and India. It's a huge countries. Well, India still, I think, will go on. And there's still way to go, but it's a very rapid portion maybe ended. Then the slowdown of the worldwide growth is just kind of just reflecting all many countries, and not really many, but it's a major like China, India, those countries are already become middle income countries. That may be actually a good thing in a sense. So it's have to disentangle these two, maybe I think important. And then if we think theoretically, potential growth, very pure theoretically, shouldn't be so much affected by policy or anything. Should be anything. It's a technology and capital accumulation and human capital accumulation, right? But of course, if we say potential in a typical way, it's a more like a medium-term trend growth. In that case, it should be, of course, include policies and then institutions. But then policies and institutions we say is if it's a very pure theoretical sense, we don't really have so much pure theoretical growth enhancing policy, maybe except for already well-established patent system. That's already good for the potential TFP growth. But otherwise, to me, the many policies or institutional factors are often just barriers to the pure potential growth. Barriers, as you know, that we say when we talk about structural reform policy. Usually we are talking about removing the barriers, removing some distortions, distorting policies, right? Rather than saying we should have more subsidy, blah, blah, blah. So there's a fine, I think, distinction between when we say policy, the one guy might say, some people might say we need more industrial policy with more subsidy or something, blah, blah, but I don't think that may be a good idea, usually, except for there's the externality. The externality here is a climate related one. That I still agree. If there's an externality, we do need a subsidy or tax, maybe some kind of government intervention. But other portion of the structural reform related policy is rather try to reduce the too much intervention by the government. At least I'm in Japan. I feel huge fiscal stimulus every year is not really working at all much in this country. And maybe you see that the road, highway do not go anywhere. And lots of like entry restrictions in banking sector, whatever the sector is. There's a lot of those distorting policies everywhere. So that the policy, as well as institutions, of course, rule of law, property rights, those are really need to establish. But at the same time, maybe too much protectionism sometimes going, especially I feel in advanced countries, kind of protecting populistic or protectionism type policies seems to be increased. So that when we talk about policy and institutional setup, we have to deal with two sides. Very actively, something we have to government have to involve. That's kind of externality related, as you said, climate related. On the other hand, if we say structural reform, I think it's a little bit different. That try to reduce distortions. I think that's a distinction. If there's more distinction on those issues, I think it would be great to hear. And then other things, probably for now, I think it's all. Yes. One thing is the maybe you mentioned, but I couldn't hear well, or the very potential including female labor force participation and the issues is about labor share and labor participation, right? And then especially what do you think about TFP increase in services mean? Because services is mostly labor intensive. If we wanna increase the TFP in services, that would be we use more AIs and robots, maybe actually substituting labors. In Japan, we have one interesting hotel chain coming up. That hotel chain uses robots, and as a receptionist, for example. Definitely substituting workers, I see. But then, but that also maybe discourage or maybe lower the wage as well as even female labor force participation. Maybe that's there. So there's some tension I see there. What do you think about it? Is kind of I wanna know your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ueda, for sharing your thoughts and comments on the report and the presentation just made by Ayhan and Franziska. Before inviting Ayhan and Franziska to come in to share their responses, I would like to encourage everyone watching the seminar to put together your questions and post it on the Q&A section, either in Japanese or in English, so that I'll read on your behalf, asking the speakers to respond. So with that, Ayhan and Franziska, please come in to share your responses to what Professor Ueda just said. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I start. So, Kenichi, you raised some very important issues. This catch-up is actually one of the drivers of potential growth in emerging markets and developing economies. I wish I could remember exactly the average per capita potential growth level in emerging markets, developing economies relative to advanced economies. I know that in low-income countries is somewhere in the low teens, about a tenth of the per capita income of advanced economies, but there's still some catch-up to do. So you're right, there are two factors. Advanced economies, there is a slowdown underway. It's almost entirely driven by demographics. And emerging markets and developing economy, that slowdown, that yellow bar that was there, the leftover, a chunk of that is the catch-up process kind of slowing down as they're approaching nearing, closing the gap, as they're closing the gap. So that's part of it. How much of the slowdown is China? And I wish we had the chart in there. So a good chunk of the slowdown from 5% to 6% in potential growth between the last decade and the next decade is due to China, but there is still a slowdown, a smaller slowdown in the other emerging markets and developing economies. Now the policy scenarios, you're absolutely right. We assume that there are some policies that achieve the investment boost and that achieve this increase in labor force participation by women and older workers. But we don't tell you which policies might be the silver bullet that achieves this. So that depends very much on every country. But yes, that's the challenge, finding those policies that work. So exactly like you're saying, the other assumption is that the relationship between investment and potential growth remains the same as always been. So investment is also a big driver of the productivity growth that you're saying is the technology-driven growth. You need investment to install the new technologies that then bring the productivity. But the assumption is that here, the underlying assumption is that that new investment that comes, perhaps a green investment, will have the same relationship to productivity and potential growth as it always had. But if that investment has a purpose that's not to increase productivity, but to save the planet, that relationship may not hold, just like you're saying. So another bold assumption. But all these assumptions point towards the downside risks. They basically all point towards us being still too optimistic, even with this at current trend scenario. And finally, this TFP and services, I share your concern there. Not even for TFP, whether you can generate this TFP growth and still have labor force participation increasing. Is it possible to have both? Even for something much simpler, something we're not showing in this presentation, but that's shown in the book. If you look at all the 15 subsectors of services, I think it was 13 or 17, the more than a dozen subsectors of services, and you compare their labor productivity or total factor productivity in these 50 subsectors to manufacturing, there are only 2 that have higher productivity, and that's finance and real estate. It's very difficult to generate sustained growth out of finance and real estate. So we kind of share your sort of caution in hoping much to achieve much with services, but maybe this will bring a productivity boost and turn growth around. That's it from my end. Ayhan, would you like to add?
Yeah, no, thank you, Kenichi. It's wonderful to see you. For those of you,
Let's see you. Thank you.
Kenichi was my colleague in the IMF, and actually we used to be in the same division
Yes.
for some years.
And Francisca too. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you had very good colleagues in the IMF. What can I say? So the Kenichi, thank you for your question, and all three of them, I think, the issues to be discussed. The first one, I think what you are saying, look, of course, as countries converge, they slow, and the frontiers economy is slow because they are getting close to their steady state or they are at the steady state. In the context of convergence of emerging developing economies, yes, their growth is going to slow down, but you want them to slow down in a way that they are still in per capita terms delivering higher growth, so they are converging. In many developing economies, the challenge is that in per capita terms, they are not growing as fast as advanced economies doing. And that's an issue from year to year. What we are documenting, this bigger challenge of having, potential growth slowing, and of course that's also telling us their ability to generate growth will be constrained in coming years. The slowdown in potential growth is something much more serious than actual growth, because it's all about your ability to generate growth. But your point about convergence is very well taken. Your second point, the policies should ultimately reduce distortions. The policies should not intervene how the economy operates. In the book, we discuss an extensive menu of policies. I share your concern in the context of, for example, protectionist policies that have been becoming popular in some circles under different guises. Fragmentation for a variety of reasons. And then, of course, the use of industrial policy. I think the policymakers naturally would like to have all types of policies under their disposal. I would like to have, 10 policy instruments if I'm a policymakers rather than 5. And depending on where I am in the cycle, I would like to use, different types of measures. All of the policy measures we are recommending pretty much about eliminating distortions and trying to improve fundamental drivers of potential growth. What are those, the productivity? How we are going to basically improve productivity? Of course, you need to invest in research and development. Of course, you need to find ways to accelerate investment growth, and with that, hopefully, TFP will come picking up as well. But your points are very well taken. I invite all colleagues to look at the study we have. As I mentioned, it's a sizable book, and it has a huge section on discussing just policies to promote potential growth. Now, I think the kind of the increasing TFP in services, the challenge there, yes, there could be technologies that will lead to displacement of labor. But what we have seen in the past, especially in the context of manufacturing, Kenichi, you know very well, you might have much smaller manufacturing sector, which exactly what happened in industrialized countries, advanced economies. You might have a much smaller agricultural sector. And at some point in the past, these sectors used to employ very large share of labor force. That's not the case anymore. But you look around the world, in advanced economies, we are not talking about basically abundance of labor. We are talking about, in fact, labor shortages. It's true in the case of Japan, it's true in the United States, it's true in Europe, and of course, UK. Now, whether these the innovations based on machine learning technologies, artificial intelligence, will translate into really truly a decline in the labor demand, that has to be seen. I think in some circles there is research showing that, but there is definitely more research is needed. Now, in the case of the role of female labor force participation, Francisca discussed these issues. When we look at South Asia, when we look at Middle East, a huge chunk of the society is outside of the labor force relative to you look at advanced economies. In the case of Japan, this has been a challenge. There were a wide range of policies. Even recently, under this government, Japan introduced policies to incentivize the female labor force participation. The thing is that given the demographic patterns we observe in some regions, we need to find ways to really push labor force participation through bringing more female members of the society into the labor force, or basically thinking about adjusting, the productive life assumptions. I don't need to talk about these issues with this Japanese audience because you are very familiar with these things. People have much longer life expectancy. With that, their ability to contribute more for a longer time period increases. And I think in the case of Japan, we see that all the time. And in some other societies, the challenge is totally different. The challenge is to generate jobs for younger segments of the society because they have on the, in a sense, positive side of the demographic transition. I think big question for our profession is to think about going forward. There is this big euphoria when it comes to technologies based on machine learning, the artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call, whether this euphoria we think credibly translate into very large growth dividends. I think we would be more than happy to see those types of growth dividends. The issue is that so far, unfortunately, despite the kind of the huge innovations, at least measured productivity slowdown has not changed. And in this case, what we are discussing is potential growth, and that slowdown, I think, has been well known. We just provided a big picture argument along with the database, and I hope more people will look at that database. But once again, Kenichi, thank you very much for your comments. Let me turn to Koichi.
Yeah, thank you. Just one comment. I totally agree with the labor force participation issue. At the same time, in Japan's case, I believe at least somewhat the labor force female labor force participation issues. And at least in Japan, female labor force participation rate has been increasing past 10, 20 years. One of the reasons is indeed we don't have many workers around in this country. And that then reminded me of other issue especially in developing countries about the child labor issues. You didn't mention it, but maybe you also maybe better to mention to how to educate more kids up until maybe at least 14 years old, because many still in poor countries working as of just graduating elementary school, right? So maybe another 3 years for education needed. So the low participation for the child labor, but more participation for the adult female portion, I think needed. At the same time, it's about the demographic as well as this kind of labor shortage in advanced countries issues. It also can be well treated if we allow more immigration worldwide, more movement, and on that issue, do you have any comments?
I can take the first one. I leave the immigration to you. You know, this what you're mentioning about education and labor force participation, very interesting. The way we construct our labor component of the potential growth is a bunch of regressions, panel regressions of 5-year age groups of the labor force participation by 5-year age groups by gender.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear that the higher the education level, the longer they remain attached throughout their working lives, including at very old age, or even age groups above 65 are more, the labor force participation is higher if they're more educated. So that's a policy that bears fruit throughout. It's really clear. More than health. Health is something that really helps us keep the older workers in the labor market. Education is something that all workers, other than the very youngest, to stay longer in the labor force. I hand over to you for immigration.
Yeah, so thank you, Kenichi. On the child labor issue, we do not want any child to be employed, period. So we think that education has very high returns, and the all children should have get the education they deserve, and hopefully all the way to graduate school, and they are fully equipped. And in many parts of the world, of course, it is a big issue, but at the same time, there is incredible demand for skilled labor. On the other issue you mentioned, I think Francisca has already talked about it a little bit. The bigger challenge with respect to finding labor forces all governments to look at their migration policies very carefully. Different governments have different policies. We released a World Development Report on migration issues. I'm not sure, Koichi, that report was presented in Tokyo. But one of the important messages in that report is the migration can be a solution under certain circumstances. But those circumstances differ greatly across countries. So the policies need to be adjusted in a way that the country circumstances are taken into account. I think in some cases the big issue is to have this skilled labor force from just the kind of the receiving country perspective. That's wonderful, having the skilled labor force. but at the same time, you would like to be careful about the drain of these skilled labor force from developing economies to advanced economies. And increasingly, this is a huge challenge everywhere. And I think that in the context of potential growth, in the context of declining labor force participation and demographic challenges, the countries are basically forced to think these issues much more carefully and much more rationally. But let me turn to Koichi. Thank you, Kenichi, again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayhan and Francisca, for your responses, and Ueda Sensei for your, another round of the comment and question. Really appreciate it. We received the question from our viewers, and let me read this question. And then after reading this question, I will ask in order of Ueda Sensei and Francisca and Ayhan to share with us a final remarks. And particularly for Ayhan and Francisca, please touch upon on this question that raised by the viewers. But of course, Ueda Sensei, you are welcome to make any comments. Question is this. This is a question from Mr. Ueki from the Japan Housing Finance Agency. Thank you for your informative presentation. If I understand correctly, Chinese economy contribution has been a key driver of economic growth in EMDE's last decade. How do you assess the economic contribution by ASEAN member nations during the same period and another decade from now on? Thank you. So this was a question by Ueki-san. And then please keep this question in your mind. And I would like to invite, in order of Ueda Sensei, Francisca, and Ayhan to share the very final remarks. And then we conclude the seminar. So Ueda Sensei, any final remarks from you? Thank you.
Sorry, I haven't prepared well, but it's a really, I think, important to thinking about our worldwide economic growth, because worldwide economic growth is, I think, is still a fundamental sources of our happiness and living standards everywhere in the world. And we do see increasing challenge in terms of more trade barriers, and looks like distortive subsidies adopted, especially in many advanced countries. And those things is happening right now. And somehow each researchers or those like Ayhan, Francisca, those who are working very hard in the international organization, everywhere in the government sector too, we have to say more strongly about to preserve better, higher trend of economic growth, especially at this juncture. And on that purpose, I think the book and the presentation by Ayhan, Francisca is very great, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ueda, for your final remarks. I would like to invite Francisca to come in to share your final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kenichi, for joining us. It's so good to see you. I just want to pick up that question that the participant asked. So yes, a lot of the slowdown in emerging market developing potential growth over the remainder of this decade is because of China. In fact, 0.8 out of 1 percentage point slowdown that is baked into the system already. But this is a slowdown that goes well beyond China. In the majority of emerging markets and developing economies, potential growth will slow. And that's just something to start factoring into policy. Unless there's a big structural change, this is just something that finance ministries need to bake into their policies. Companies need to bake into their policies. Trade is just not going to grow that much. So it's going to be harder to grow in external markets. And it's something that central banks also need to factor into our policies. Inflation will become harder to achieve, inflation targets, and development ministries will have to bake into their policies. And it's not clear that everyone is quite adjusted to that prospect yet. Back to you, Koichi.
Thank you very much. Ayhan, please come in for your final remarks.
So wonderful. In the context of ASEAN member nations, obviously these are one of the most dynamic groups of countries in the world. When you think about Indonesia, when you think about Vietnam, and the other countries, Philippines, basically the potential to deliver sustained growth over a long time period. And some of the countries in that group also already delivered significant growth rates over an extended period of time, such as Thailand. We think that the ASEAN member nations have significant potential to continue as a group to deliver significant growth rates in 2020s. And we, of course, discuss these issues in detail in the book when we look at the regional dimensions. So in terms of concluding remarks, what is important here, the slowing potential growth is a huge challenge. And it's taking place along with the climate crisis and multiple other crises. The good news is that we can think about each crisis presenting an opportunity. In the context of climate crisis, we need to have massive investments. And as Francisca showed, in some cases, these investment needs can easily turn into huge surges. And when these types of surges in investment take place, they have obviously consequences for potential growth. But we need to be intelligent when you take these types of the investment projects about climate-friendly technologies and make sure we are not compromising government's ability to have, reasonable fiscal policies. In a nutshell, yes, it's a huge challenge when it comes to slowing potential growth, but there is even larger opportunity. So there are good reasons to be optimistic about policymakers' ability to turn this slowdown around and even deliver, in some cases, higher potential growth down the road, thanks to these investment needs when it comes to skilled, basically labor force and broader participation of different segments of the society. With that, positive message, I will conclude, Koichi. Let me use this opportunity again to thank our Tokyo office promoting our work, Koichi, of course, carrying the flag, and thanks again, Kenichi, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. With us this morning from Washington, we had the Ayhan Kosei, the Deputy Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and the Director of the Prospect Group, and Francisca Ohne-Zolge, who actually is now a new Chief Economist for South Asia region of the World Bank. And also from Tokyo side, we had the Professor Kenichi Ueda of the University of Tokyo discussing the latest report, Falling Long-Term Growth Prospects, Trends Expectations and Policies. Thank you very much, all of you, and also everyone watching the seminar. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now. Bye.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
Kenichi.
Bye.
Bye.
Next week, we are going to have two morning seminars. One is that we are going to feature the new report, Export to Improve Labor Market in the Middle East and North Africa. We are going to have Gladys Lopez Azevedo and Raymond Robertson, Professor Raymond Robertson. And this is going to be happening at 8 a.m. in the morning, July 20th, Thursday, Japan Standard Time. And also on Friday, 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, we are going to feature the effect of the multilateral enterprises on climate change report. This was released in March this year. We are going to have Victor Steenwagen as a speaker for that seminar. Please check our website for details. With that, I would like to once again thank you everyone for watching the seminar. I would like to close the seminar. Thank you.